The silence in Eliza Stokes' apartment felt almost suffocating, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustle of her blanket as she shifted on the couch, these were the only sounds in the dimly lit room. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, just like any other. She had returned from work hours ago, drained and exhausted, craving nothing more than a quiet evening in her small city apartment. The kind of peace she'd become accustomed to. A cup of tea, her favorite book, maybe a show on TV, nothing more. The apartment, with its soft, warm lighting, had always felt like a refuge, a place to unwind, to forget the noise and chaos of the world outside. Tonight, though, there was something different in the air. A strange weight, almost imperceptible, hung over her, just out of reach but undeniably present. It was the kind of feeling you couldn't explain, but that you couldn't shake either. Her phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the heavy silence. Eliza's hand instinctively reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cool glass of the screen. She half expected another useless email or a reminder she'd already dismissed earlier in the day. Instead, her eyes scanned the notification that had popped up from the emergency alert system. Emergency alert. Lock your doors now. There is an unknown threat in the area. Stay inside and stay alert. Authorities will follow up shortly. Her first reaction was one of dismissive annoyance. Another overblown warning, like all the others she'd seen in the past. Unknown threat? The thought was laughable. Eliza had lived in this building for years, and while she couldn't deny that odd things occasionally happened, neighborhood incidents, weird rumors, nothing had ever really threatened her. She set her phone back down without a second thought, intending to ignore it. It was nothing more than a precautionary message, one of those things that made people paranoid. But then, almost immediately, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her best friend, Tessa. "Did you get the alert? This doesn't feel right, Eliza. Something's off? Are you safe? Did you lock the door?" Eliza couldn't help but chuckle at her friend's concern. Tessa was always so careful, so cautious about everything. Maybe it was the city's constant state of tension that had made her this way, but Eliza couldn't see what the big deal was. It was probably some isolated incident, and she certainly wasn't about to lock herself away in a panic. With a grin, Eliza quickly typed back, "Don't worry, Tessa. It's probably nothing. Just another alert. I'm fine, promise." Yet, as her fingers hovered over the screen, a gnawing feeling began to settle in her chest. There was a brief moment of hesitation, a whisper in the back of her mind urging her to take the warning seriously, but she quickly dismissed it. Overthinking it, she muttered to herself, trying to push the uneasy sensation away. Then, the knock came. At first, it was barely audible, a soft tap against the wood of her front door. So quiet, she thought it could have been a trick of the wind. But no, there it was again, this time a little louder, more insistent. A quiet knock, almost too gentle, yet so deliberate. Eliza frowned. Who could it be? A late-night delivery? Someone she didn't recognize? She rose from the couch, stretching her arms above her head, in an attempt to shake off the strange feeling that had begun to creep through her. She glanced through the peephole, but saw nothing. No one. Just the shadowy corridor of the building outside her door. A few stray sounds echoed from other apartments, muffled voices, a TV playing somewhere, but nothing that seemed out of place. The knocking stopped, but it was only brief. A few moments later, it returned, this time softer, almost pleading. Her hand hovered over the door handle as the urge to open it warred with a strange sense of dread that bloomed in her chest. Who would be knocking at this hour? Confused and slightly irritated, Eliza decided to open the door. She swung it wide, half expecting to find some neighbor with a question or a lost package. But the hallway was empty. No one was there. Just the cold, empty space that stretched down the corridor in both directions. She stood frozen, blinking at the emptiness. The hallway seemed impossibly silent, as if the world outside her apartment had simply stopped. No footsteps, no voices, not even the hum of a distant elevator, just eerie, unnerving stillness. Shaking her head, she stepped back inside, closing the door behind her and locking it once again. But that strange, nagging sensation remained. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. The air around her felt colder, too. The room, once so comforting, now felt distant, as though something had shifted just slightly in the space. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed louder, as if it had been growing steadily until now, when it finally became noticeable. The glow from the TV screen flickered, the images distorting for a split second before stabilizing again. Eliza, trying to brush away the discomfort, sank back into the couch, pulling the blanket around her shoulders more tightly. She tried to refocus her attention on the show she had put on, but the screen seemed to blur and the noise seemed to swell in the quiet space. And then, as she turned her head slightly to glance at the window, she noticed something. The street outside was eerily quiet. Usually, by this time of night, the streets were filled with the hum of distant cars, the soft shuffle of people walking home. But now, nothing. Not a single car passed by. No one walked on the sidewalk. The streetlights cast long, thin shadows, flickering intermittently, adding to the disquiet. It was almost as if the entire city had decided to hold its breath, waiting. Eliza's eyes darted back to the hallway, the dark space stretching before her. The apartment felt wrong. She couldn't place it, but something had changed. The weight of the silence was too thick now. The temperature had dropped, and despite the blankets, she shivered. As she stared into the darkness beyond the living room, a faint noise caught her attention. The softest rustling sound. It was coming from somewhere nearby, but she couldn't pinpoint where. Her head snapped to the left, eyes searching the shadows, but there was nothing. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, and she wondered if it had just been her imagination. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that she was just tired. But the unsettling feeling refused to let go. She stood up and moved toward the kitchen, hoping the routine motion would calm her nerves. Her steps were slow, careful, as if the room had become an alien space, unfamiliar and ominous. The silence seemed heavier here. Her fingers brushed the light switch, and she flipped it on. For a split second, the lights flickered, just a brief glitch in the illumination. But in that moment, everything stopped. The refrigerator hummed, the TV buzzed, but the room felt frozen in time. Then, as the lights buzzed back to life, the knock came again. It was louder this time, more forceful, more insistent. Eliza froze. She hadn't heard anyone at the door. Had she? Her heart began to pound in her chest. The knock, coming from somewhere deeper in the apartment now, was not just at the door anymore. It was coming from somewhere inside the walls. Something was wrong. And whatever it wasn't just trying to get inside. It was already here. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest as the knock echoed through her apartment. Deeper now, coming from somewhere inside the walls. It wasn't just a knock at the door anymore. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing with a malevolent presence that she couldn't see, but could certainly feel. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, and she fought to steady her breath. Every instinct told her to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. She stood there in the dark, frozen in place, her hand still hovering over the light switch. The moment the knock had stopped, she'd heard something else, something almost imperceptible. A low hum, as though the apartment itself was vibrating. But no matter how hard she focused, there was nothing to explain it, no obvious cause. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Trying to steady herself, Eliza finally forced her legs to move. She glanced around the room again, her eyes flicking to the corners, the ceiling, the floor, as if expecting to see something hidden there. Her gaze landed on the clock on the wall, 3:12 a.m. It was far too late to be hearing things like this. She wasn't a paranoid person. Usually she was calm and collected. But tonight, something inside her screamed that she was being watched. Not just watched, but hunted. She turned back toward her bedroom, hoping to escape the chill that had settled in her bones. She needed rest, or at least to try to rest. She crawled into bed, pulling the covers tight around her. The apartment was silent now, but the weight of the silence felt like a pressure against her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of her blanket made her jump. Every shadow in her room seemed to grow, to stretch, to twist into something that wasn't quite right. Her phone, lying on the nightstand, suddenly vibrated. Eliza's eyes snapped open. She grabbed it, her pulse quickening as she stared at the unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. She didn't recognize it. She hesitated for a moment, thinking about ignoring it, but something compelled her to answer. She took a shaky breath and pressed the phone to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice trembled, betraying her calm exterior. For a moment, there was nothing but static. A low, crackling sound that filled her ears. It was like the phone line was broken, but there was something else in the noise. Something deeper, almost like a whisper. And then the voice came through. Distorted, muffled. It didn't sound human at first. Eliza's blood ran cold as she heard her name, the sound warped and unrecognizable. Eliza. It wasn't a voice she knew, but it was a voice she could never forget. The tone was wrong, cracked, broken, as if it was coming through a speaker that was barely working. It was familiar in a way that made her skin crawl, yet foreign at the same time. "Eliza," the voice repeated, slow, deliberate, almost coaxing. Her stomach turned. "Who is this?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though she didn't know why she bothered. She already knew something was wrong. The air in her room seemed to thicken with each second that passed. Her heart raced, her throat tightening. She gripped the phone tighter, as if it could protect her from whatever was on the other end. There was a long pause, and then the voice came back, clearer this time, but still distorted, like something was wrong with the line. "I know your name, where you live, your secrets." The words seemed to slice through the stillness of her room, making her stomach churn with dread. How could anyone know that? Eliza had never given anyone her address except for family and close friends. No one else could know that. No one else should know that. The way the voice dragged each word out made it sound as if it was savoring her discomfort. She tried to force herself to stay calm, but her mind raced. How did they know her secrets? What did they want from her? "Why are you calling me?" Eliza's voice shook, the question more to herself than to whoever or whatever was on the other end. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it spoke with chilling certainty. "Lock all the doors, Eliza. Lock them all. Now." The command was so forceful that Eliza felt an icy chill crawl down her spine. Her fingers trembled, gripping the phone as though it might slip from her hand at any moment. She glanced toward her apartment door, as if seeing it for the first time. Was it locked? She had locked it earlier, didn't she? She couldn't remember for sure. The voice continued, its tone becoming more urgent. "Something is already inside your home. It's been there for hours, Eliza. You didn't notice, but it has been waiting." The room seemed to close in on her. She didn't know who was on the phone, but the certainty in their words made her stomach flip. What did it mean? What had been waiting in her apartment? A noise, a faint scrape, came from somewhere behind her. She whipped her head around, her breath catching in her throat. But there was nothing, just the same shadows in the corners of the room. Her mind was playing tricks on her, she told herself. She was just tired. But the voice on the phone was growing more frantic now, more shrill, as though something was threatening to break through. "Eliza, they're watching you. Get away from the windows. They can see you, Eliza. They're in the shadows, waiting. And if you don't move now, you'll never see daylight again." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Eliza felt frozen, as if her very bones had turned to ice. She could hear the distorted voice growing louder, more frantic, but her body refused to obey. The air felt suffocating now, pressing in on her from all sides. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She glanced back at the window, feeling an unnatural cold radiating from the glass. She couldn't see anything outside. The streetlights cast their usual dim glow across the sidewalk, but there was something off about the stillness of the night. The wind had died down completely, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The voice, still distorted, now sounded like a growl. "It's already too late, Eliza. They're inside." Her breath hitched as her eyes darted to the door again, her legs instinctively moving toward it. She needed to lock it, to make sure it was locked. But as her hand touched the handle, the phone in her ear crackled one last time. Then, as if on cue, the call ended. The line went dead. Eliza stood there, frozen. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her ears rang with the remnants of the distorted voice. The apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison, and she was no longer sure if it was the phone call or something else that had truly haunted her. A deep, unsettling silence filled the room, but it wasn't the quiet she had known before. The silence now felt suffocating, almost suffocating enough to smother her. she could still hear the faint echo of the voice in her mind, as if it was lingering, waiting, and watching. As her phone went dead in her hand, Eliza's gaze swept around the room. The shadows were deeper now, thicker, more oppressive. Something had changed. Something had shifted. Something was waiting. And it was no longer just a voice on the other end of the line. Eliza stood frozen in the middle of the room, her mind racing. Her phone still hung limply in her hand, the line silent now. The fear that had been building in her chest since the call was like a living thing, creeping through her veins, making her skin tingle with an icy chill. The apartment felt wrong, as if the walls were closing in on her, the air thick with an unspoken threat. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just nerves, that the phone call had gotten to her more than she'd realized. But the quiet that surrounded her now wasn't comforting. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of quiet that stretched on too long until it started to suffocate you. Her eyes darted around the room, catching every flicker of shadow, every tiny movement. There were sounds in the air, small ones, barely audible, but they made her heart race. A scraping noise, like something sharp dragging across the wall. A faint shuffle of footsteps, too soft to be real, but too deliberate to be imagined. She turned quickly, her breath quickening, but there was nothing there. Another scrape. It came from the hallway this time. Her hands shook as she slowly walked toward the noise, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was dark, the lights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. She walked slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was cold, the chill creeping along her spine like fingers made of ice. She reached the hallway mirror, and her reflection was the first thing she saw. Then she froze. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the mirror's edge, stood a figure, a shadow, its shape indistinct, but it was there. It was unnaturally still, too still. Eliza's blood ran cold. She couldn't tell if it was a person or something else, some shape, some presence that shouldn't have been there. Her breath hitched in her throat, her legs refusing to move, frozen in place as her eyes locked on the figure. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Eliza blinked, her heart racing. She told herself it was just her imagination, that it had to be. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't. But the feeling in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. She quickly turned and walked past the hallway, trying to push the image of the figure from her mind. But as she made her way into the kitchen, she couldn't shake the unease. The coldness in the room hit her instantly, colder than the hallway had been. The kitchen lights buzzed above her, flickering for a moment before stabilizing. She tried to focus, to keep her thoughts from spiraling, but something in the corner of her vision caught her attention. A shadow, a dark, human-shaped silhouette standing in the far corner of the kitchen. But there was no one there. Her breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, her eyes searching the corner frantically. Nothing. It was just her mind playing tricks on her, she told herself. She had to calm down. She closed her eyes for a second, forcing herself to breathe deeply, counting each inhale and exhale. She opened her eyes, determined to push away the panic that was creeping up her throat. And there it was again. The shadow was gone. She tried to tell herself it was just the way the light shifted, the way the shadows played tricks on her mind. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The shadow had been there, and it had moved. A low groan of the floorboards echoed behind her, sharp and sudden, making her jump. The house seemed to groan and creak, as if it were alive, shifting around her, settling in ways that felt unnatural. The temperature had dropped further, and the silence between the noises felt too heavy. The walls seemed to pulse, like they were breathing, and Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Something was waiting. Her legs moved before her mind could fully process what was happening. She rushed back into the living room, her feet barely making a sound on the cold floor. She was dizzy now, disoriented, like the room had somehow tilted on its axis. She stumbled, barely catching herself before hitting the couch. She gripped the armrest, trying to steady her shaking hands. Her chest was tight, and she couldn't seem to breathe right. Every little sound, every whisper in the walls, felt amplified. She was trapped. As she glanced toward the hallway mirror again, she froze. There, in the reflection, the silhouette stood once more. Only this time, it wasn't at the end of the hallway. It was right behind her. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She whipped around, her hands flying out to the empty space behind her. But there was nothing, no one. Just the same empty living room, the same dark corners that seemed to press in on her. The terror in her chest was like a physical force now, suffocating her, tightening around her lungs. Her thoughts raced, spinning wildly, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But all she found was the suffocating silence. The kind of silence that was never really silence. The kind that made you feel like you were being watched. The kind that made you feel like you weren't alone. And she wasn't. She knew that now. The shadows moved, slow and deliberate, as if something was shifting within them. But it wasn't just the shadows anymore. The air was thick, heavy with something she couldn't see, but could feel. The temperature continued to drop, the chill so intense now it felt like ice creeping into her veins. Eliza turned back toward the mirror, but the figure was gone. No trace of it, not even a hint of movement. She stood there, trembling, her mind racing, unsure if she had seen it at all. But then, in the corner of her eye, the air shifted again. She turned toward the kitchen, her body tense with fear, expecting to see the shadow once more. The figure wasn't there. But something else was. Something was behind her. Her pulse shot into her throat, and she spun again, gasping for air, her legs nearly giving out under her. But there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, no movement at all. Just the feeling of being watched. The terror, cold and suffocating, clawed at her, and she didn't know how much longer she could stand it. Whatever was in the apartment with her, it wasn't done yet. It wasn't done with her. And as she stood there, every muscle tensed, every breath shallow, she could almost hear it. A whisper. Soft, right behind her. The whispering never stopped. It lingered in her ears, so faint she thought she was imagining it. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just her mind playing tricks. The air around her felt too thick, too suffocating. Each breath was harder than the last, like she was inhaling ice. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something following her every move, but she couldn't see it. She glanced in the mirror again, her pulse racing, hoping for some comfort in the familiar reflection of herself. But the moment she did, she froze. Her reflection, it wasn't right. She had moved to brush a strand of hair from her face, and the reflection did the same. But it lingered for just a second longer, a split second where it seemed to mock her. Eliza blinked, and her reflection didn't. It stared back, unblinking, its eyes empty, unfeeling. Her stomach churned, a sickening dread filling her. She stepped back, too fast, stumbling, but her reflection stayed steady, unmoving, except for its unblinking stare. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, trying to steady herself, but when she opened them again, there it was. The reflection was smiling, but she wasn't. It wasn't a kind smile. It was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. Its eyes were hollow, gleaming with something dark, something malicious. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she staggered back. The reflection, still smiling, didn't move. It just stayed there, grinning back at her with that terrifying empty gaze. She reached up to touch her own face, but when she did, her reflection, it didn't. It stayed frozen, its grin widening more and more. Then, just as quickly as she had moved, the reflection mirrored her. Every little shift, every motion was slightly delayed. But the longer she looked at it, the more she realized it wasn't just delayed, it was wrong. The reflection was twisting, mocking her with every movement she made. It started to move on its own, making faces, grimacing, sneering, as if it was playing with her, enjoying her fear. The whispers were louder now. They filled the room, filling every corner, the voices coming from behind the mirrors, from inside the walls, echoing through her mind. It's waiting. It's coming for you. Eliza's heart thudded in her chest, panic creeping into her throat. She turned away from the mirror, hoping to escape its twisted gaze, but the reflection didn't follow her. It stayed there, unmoving for a moment. Then, it grinned again, wider this time, as if to say, "You can't escape." Every step Eliza took was a battle to keep her legs from giving out beneath her. She needed to get out, needed to find somewhere safe. But the feeling of the reflection's eyes on her never stopped. It was alive now, no longer just glass and image. It was aware of her, watching her, mocking her every move. She couldn't tear herself away from the reflection. Every time she tried to move, the reflection moved before her, as if it had a mind of its own. It mimicked her actions at first, but now it seemed to act on its own, twisting its features into something grotesque. It leaned forward, its grin widening. Eliza's breath came faster, her chest tightening. Her own reflection was mocking her, its movements too smooth, too deliberate, as if it was in control. She turned her head, trying to look away, but the reflection followed her every move. The grin didn't fade. Instead, it grew. The whispers kept coming, getting louder, growing in intensity. It's here. It's coming. It's already inside. Eliza could feel it then. The pressure in the air, the weight of the reflection's eyes on her. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real. It was alive. The room grew colder, colder than it had been before. The lights flickered above her, casting the room in a sickly, wavering light. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisted and long. The temperature continued to drop, making her breath visible in front of her, thick and white like smoke. She couldn't take it anymore. She turned quickly, backing away from the mirror, but the reflection didn't stop. It was still there, staring, grinning, its face distorting with every new movement she made. The reflection's grin grew wider until it was stretching the edges of its face. And then, in a horrifying moment, Eliza saw something that made her blood run cold. The reflection reached out. Its hand, her hand, but not hers, shot forward past the mirror's surface. The fingers reached out as if they were trying to cross into her world, trying to reach her. Eliza screamed and stumbled back, but the reflection's hand didn't stop. It stretched further, closer to her. Her heart raced. She couldn't breathe. The reflection's eyes were fixed on her now, its expression twisted in a mocking grin, its fingers just inches from her skin. She stepped back again, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt like it was shrinking around her. With every breath, the reflection moved closer, its fingers almost touching the glass, like it was pulling itself through. Eliza's blood ran cold as she screamed again, backing away as fast as her legs would carry her. But no matter how fast she moved, no matter how far she ran, the reflection didn't stop. It kept staring, its eyes locked onto hers. And now, there was no escaping it. The reflection was here, and it wasn't going anywhere. Eliza's screams echoed in the cold, empty room. Eliza's mind raced as she stumbled back from the mirror. The reflection was still there, its fingers just inches from her skin. But now, something was different. The air felt thick, suffocating. The house itself seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, watching her, feeding off her fear. She could feel it in the walls, in the floorboards beneath her feet, in the shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the room. She turned, frantic, looking for a way out. But every door she tried was locked. The windows sealed shut, as if the house itself were holding her captive. She tried to breathe, but each breath felt heavier than the last. The house, no, it wasn't just a house anymore. It was something else, something dark, alive. The whispers, low and sinister, filled the space around her. They crawled into her ears, curling into her mind, their words scraping at her sanity. "You can't escape," they whispered. "It's too late." Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed away from the mirror, from the suffocating weight of the house. But there was no place to run. Every room felt smaller, closing in around her. Every corner seemed to hold something just out of sight. The shadows twisted and moved, like they were alive, hungry, waiting for her to slip up. Then, in the middle of the night, when the house was the quietest, the figure appeared again. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was solid, standing in the doorway to her bedroom. Eliza froze, her breath caught in her throat. She tried to scream, to call for help, but her voice wouldn't come. Her body, too, felt trapped. She couldn't move, couldn't even twitch a finger. It was as if something had wrapped chains around her, holding her in place. Her legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure stood there, silent, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. But she could feel its gaze, heavy and unblinking. It was watching her, waiting for her to make a move, to show any sign of weakness. The house seemed to grow colder, the walls pressing in tighter. Then, slowly, the figure moved. It stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, like it knew it had all the time in the world. The air around it thickened, charged with an unnatural energy. Eliza's breath quickened, her chest tightening as if the very air was being sucked out of the room. The figure took another step. Its features began to form, twisting in the shadows. It wasn't human. No, it was something far worse. The limbs were wrong, grotesque, elongated, bending in unnatural ways. The face, it wasn't a face at all, not really. It was a distorted mockery of one, stretched into an impossible grin. The grin, it grew wider, too wide, far too wide, until it seemed like its face might tear apart from the force of it. And then Eliza saw its eyes. Black, hollow pits that sucked in the light around them. It wasn't just looking at her. It was seeing her, knowing her, reading her deepest fears. And it was enjoying it. The figure's grin stretched further, and Eliza felt her legs finally give way. She collapsed back onto the bed, but the figure didn't stop moving. It was closer now, too close. The air was thick with a kind of presence that made her skin crawl, as if the house itself had wrapped its arms around her, holding her in place. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You can't run," they hissed. "You never could." Eliza's pulse thundered in her ears as she fought against the invisible force that held her down. She tried to push herself away from the bed, but her body wouldn't obey. The figure reached out, its long, twisted fingers stretching toward her. They moved with a slow, sickening grace, each finger too long, too thin. As it moved closer, its face filled with that horrible, mocking grin, Eliza felt something cold brush against her cheek. She shuddered, but she couldn't escape. "You can't run, Eliza," the figure whispered, its voice low and harsh, like the scrape of nails on a chalkboard. "You never could." And then, the grip on her tightened. The fingers wrapped around her arm, long and bony, icy cold as they squeezed. Eliza's heart skipped a beat, and she opened her mouth to scream. But nothing came out. The house was closing in, suffocating her, trapping her in the darkness. Her vision blurred. The shadows seemed to press in on her from all sides. She felt herself being pulled closer to the figure, closer to the awful, twisted smile that never stopped growing. The whispers, the figure, the house, all of it merged into one suffocating, inescapable nightmare. And then, everything went black. Eliza's world was a blur of shadows, cold air, and suffocating silence. Her mind felt like it was shattering, each crack making it harder to hold on to any sense of reality. The figure was still with her, but now it was everywhere. It wasn't just in the corner of her eyes anymore. No, the house itself had turned into it. Its walls, its floors, the very air she breathed. Every corner of the house was filled with that dark, twisted presence, seeping into her skin, into her bones. She tried to scream, but her throat felt raw, her voice a hollow echo in her mind. The house had its grip on her, and there was no escaping it. She was trapped, no longer in control of her own thoughts, her own actions. The house had consumed her. And then, just as she thought she might lose what little sanity she had left, the phone rang. Eliza didn't want to answer it. She knew it would be the caller again, that same distorted voice that had taunted her before. But this time, it wasn't just a voice. No, this time, Eliza could feel it inside her head. It wasn't just speaking to her, it was planting itself inside her mind, crawling through her thoughts like a parasite. "Did you really think you could escape?" The voice rasped, and Eliza could hear the cruel amusement in it. "The house feeds on fear, Eliza. And you've been the perfect meal. You're not the first to fall for it, and you won't be the last." Her blood ran cold. The words sank into her chest, heavy and suffocating. The caller wasn't just taunting her, it was showing her the truth. The truth she had been avoiding, the truth she never wanted to hear. "Eliza," the voice whispered again, now too close, too personal. "You think you're trapped, but you've always been here. The house has already taken you, and now, it's coming for the rest." Suddenly, the shadows around her seemed to shift, to stretch out from every corner of the room. They reached for her, pulling at her skin, crawling beneath her, in her. The house was no longer just a building. It had turned into something monstrous, something with a life of its own. She could feel it, feel the weight of it pressing down on her. The walls were closing in, tightening with every breath she took. And then something terrible happened. The reflection. It appeared again. But this time, Eliza knew. She knew it wasn't just a mirror image. It was the house itself, or rather, the true form of the house. The dark, twisted thing that had been lurking beneath the surface, feeding off her fear. It grinned at her, that same horrifying, mocking smile stretched across its face. Her own face, but warped, twisted into something unnatural, something demonic. The reflection's grin widened, impossibly wide. Eliza tried to back away, but the floor beneath her feet gave way. The shadows reached for her again, wrapping around her legs, pulling her toward the mirror, toward the creature that had become the house. "You can't run," the reflection whispered, its voice distorted and cruel. "You never could." Eliza screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the suffocating darkness that surrounded her. Her body was being pulled toward the mirror, the shadows twisting around her like chains, tightening with every movement she made. She struggled, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but it was useless. There was no escape. The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was the reflection, still grinning, its eyes black and empty, sucking the light out of the room. The house had won. It had consumed her, body and soul. And then, there was nothing. Only silence. But in that silence, Eliza could hear it. The laughter. A low, mocking laugh that echoed in her mind, as if the house itself was laughing at her, enjoying her fear, her helplessness. And then, the laughter faded, leaving nothing but the cold, empty darkness. And in that darkness, Eliza knew the truth. She was just another part of the house now, another whisper in the shadows, another victim. And the house would never let her go. The darkness swallowed everything. Eliza felt herself fade away, but something strange happened in that silence. The cold, suffocating grip of the house loosened, just for a moment, and in that brief instant, she thought she could breathe again. But then the truth hit her, like a sharp, piercing stab straight into her chest. It wasn't just the house that had consumed her. She was the house. She could feel it now. The walls, the floors, the rooms, they were her. The cold, dark corridors stretching endlessly in every direction, the oppressive weight of the silence, the suffocating presence that had been closing in on her. It was all her. She had never left. She hadn't escaped. All those moments of fear, those whispers, the figure in the hallway, the reflection, the suffocating darkness, they had all been her own creation. Eliza had never been trapped inside the house. She had been the trap. Her body, her soul, her very existence had been nothing more than a puppet, a tool designed to feed the house's insatiable hunger. She was the darkness that consumed every breath, every scream, every tear of fear. The house had used her to lure in its victims, one by one. And when they fell, when they lost themselves like she had, the house grew stronger, more powerful. Eliza tried to scream again, but there was no sound, no way to escape. She was part of the house now, the very essence of it. The laughter that had once echoed in her mind now filled her entire being, a cruel reminder of what she had become. And then, just as she felt her mind slipping away, something else happened. The phone buzzed again. The same emergency alert. Emergency alert. Lock your doors now. Her heart froze. Another victim. The phone buzzed again. But it wasn't for her anymore. The alert wasn't meant for her. It was meant for the next one. The next person to make the same mistake she had. The next person to believe they could escape, to believe they could fight back. But the house wasn't finished with them. Not yet. The new victim would fall for it, just like she had. The cycle would repeat. The house would pull them in, piece by piece, and they would become part of it too. There was no stopping it, no way out. And as the phone's vibrations faded into the distance, Eliza knew. The house was patient. It waited, always, for the next victim, for the next scream, for the next soul to swallow. Because the house never stops, it never ends, and no one ever leaves. The cycle had only just begun again.